Now let's take a look at integration between Windows Server Active Directory, or Active Directory Directory Services, as it's officially called, and Azure. So we have a few options that are available to integrate between Windows Server Active Directory and Azure. Number one, we can actually extend our on-premises Active Directory into Azure. There's a few options that we have available to us. We can actually create an Azure virtual machine that is a replica of a domain controller. So you can have a domain controller in Azure. Now, the setup of this is, you've got to set up the virtual machine in a very particular way. You've got to set up the disks and the drives in a very particular way. But it's a common thing that can be done. If you have a series of virtual machines in Azure, you're using Azure as kind of a virtual data center, and you want to have a domain controller up there, you can absolutely run a domain controller on a virtual machine that resides in Azure. And so the most common use case for this is what's often known as lift and shift. I simply have an application in a series of virtual machines, and I don't want to run it on my hardware. I want to run on a hardware that resides in Azure. I can pick up those virtual machines, drop them in Azure, domain controllers included, and I've now migrated that application up. Another option that you have available is to synchronize passwords and synchronize user accounts. What this allows you to do is, instead of having a copy of your domain in Azure in a domain controller, you can simply tell Azure Active Directory to synchronize either all or a subset of the user accounts that are in your Windows Server Active Directory, so that when the user goes to log on to an Azure resource, they're using the same username and password in the Azure portal as they use on the Windows logon screen on their laptop. So Control-Alt-Delete, log on, same username and password. User@contoso.com works on your laptop. User@contoso.com works in Azure. So that's an option that's available. And we'll look at how this works using a tool called Azure AD Connect. You also have the option of what's called pass-through authentication. This is a newer technology. And instead of replicating the user account, Azure will see the logon request and pass it to one of your on-prem domain controllers, ask it to authenticate, and then get the result back as a yes or no. This is not federation, but the result is similar in the sense that the user doesn't get pushed to Azure. The user resides in one place. We simply log on, authenticate. The authentication request is passed down, validated, the answer returned, and now we can actually go ahead and proceed to Azure. The primary tool that we use to configure these things is called Azure AD Connect. This is a tool that you download and install on a server in your on-premises environment, and you then configure that tool to connect to Azure. So the basic setup of this, and you'll see this in the demos we do, is pretty straightforward. You download Azure AD Connect. It asks you for a set of credentials for Azure that are Azure AD Administrator. It asks you for a set of credentials for your Windows Server domain. And it then configures the service to synchronize user accounts from Windows Server Active Directory up to Azure. And then gives you a series of prompts and configurations as to how you want that to work. You can choose a subset of users based on an organizational unit or a group. You can choose the frequency that they replicate. You can even choose properties that move back and forth. So you can go with a very simple configuration that just dumps everything, or get very precise as to exactly what users, exactly what properties replicate up into Azure Active Directory. And once that's in place, as long as that service is running and healthy and there are tools that monitor it, any user that you can take their same username and password, use it in the Azure portal or Office 365 or Intune, and log on, that they use on their laptop. The most common use for this, by the way, is Office 365. The majority of users that go to Office 365, they don't want to have an Office 365 set of credentials and a local network set of credentials. They want one. And so because all their user accounts exist in their on-premise domain that their company manages, that company simply puts them all in an OU and says, okay, these are my Office 365 users. Synchronize those users to Azure AD using Azure AD Connect. Tell Office 365, this instance of Azure AD is your authentication. And now all users are using the same basic list of usernames and passwords. So the same account is valid on your laptop or on the Azure website somewhere else in the world, or the Office 365 website somewhere else in the world. So here's an example of the components for this. Over here on the on the right-hand side, you have the cloud providers. On the left, you've got my on-premises providers. So I've got my users within Active Directory directory services. I install my identity bridge, which is Azure AD Connect. And that's either going to be the synchronization engine or the federation services. It will synchronize all those applications, tools, and users, make them available to Azure AD. And now, any application that's out there can use any one of the usernames and passwords that's on my on-premise environment, providing it's within the scope that's been synchronized to Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory becomes that single point of authentication for all my software as a service applications, and additionally, all my on-premise applications as well. So here's a little bit of a comparison between these different synchronization options. So we have directory synchronization only, which will simply push passwords from Windows Server Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. You have a directory synchronization option with password sync. What password sync will do is it will actually allow you to synchronize the passwords both ways. So you can make a change in either place and the password change will be replicated. This definitely reduces the administration costs, and it allows you to control all your password policies with your on-premises directory. And then finally, you have directory synchronization with single sign-on. With directory synchronization and single sign-on, it will actually use your on-premises Active Directory as the source of authentication, as the primary location for authentication, but still allow you to log on to any resource that references Azure Active Directory. And then finally, we'll take a look at pass-through authentication. Now, pass-through authentication validates all usernames and passwords on-premise only. So nothing is actually validated within Azure Active Directory. In all the previous options, Azure Active Directory contains usernames and passwords that are synchronized from your on-premise directory. With pass-through authentication, it's not synchronization. The passwords remain and the user accounts remain within Windows Server Active Directory. When you attempt to log on to an Azure Active Directory instance or a tenant that's been configured with pass-through authentication, it will then ask your on-premises Active Directory, is this username and password valid? And then based on the result, yes or no, allows you to go ahead and log on. Now this gives you incredible flexibility because you can now rely on Windows Server Active Directory for password governance, for password policies, for user administration. You can have multiple domains, you can have trusts, you can use everything you normally do, but now you log on via the Azure portal or Office 365 or whatever and use that exact same username and password. So to give an idea of kind of where this all sits, if we have just a very basic Azure AD Connect with cloud accounts, very simple, very low value, all that means is the usernames are the same. If we have password synchronization, it's a little bit better, also very simple. If we begin to add Azure AD plus pass-through authentication, now the value of this solution becomes very high. The complexity, all the same, stays pretty low. The difference here is that if you want to implement a similar solution where the username and passwords, and this is the key, reside only on premises, they don't reside in the cloud, they only reside on premises, and the cloud applications reach out to the on-premises directory for authentication, you would have had to typically use federation services, which is very complex to set up. There's certificates required, there's configuration required. Pass-through authentication gives you essentially the exact same effect. No usernames and passwords in the cloud, usernames and passwords within your on-premises directory only, and you get the exact same logon effect, but with significantly less work to set up because it can be done using Azure AD Connect.